Scripted and spontaneous. There is an association commonly made between spontaneity and authenticity. When somebody presents themselves before us and appears to react spontaneously to what we are saying, we usually read their reactions as authentic. When, conversely, they appear to have calculated what they were going to say to us beforehand and appear to respond in a strained way that betrays premeditation, we tend to read their behavior as inauthentic. This is something I had long intuited in my own performances, which are always improvised. I sensed that it was necessary to always arrive at the works spontaneously if I wanted my characters to come across as authentic, invested, or otherwise real. However, following the pathway from the literary birth of Kundra's protagonists through my own scripted characters, Rosa and Lawrence's attempts at episodic living, to Dennett's thesis on deterministic freedom, I'm led to consider the role of scripting in giving rise to agency, and to question whether rehearsal and scriptedness should necessarily be read as antithetical to authentic self-presentation. Following Conway's game of life, in which gliders glide, blinkers blink, and edge shooters shoot with their own pixelated brand of joie de vivre, I'm led to think about the very scripts that possibly underlie and govern my spontaneity when orally devising characters and stories through improvisational performance. In this respect, maybe spontaneity and scriptedness is a false dichotomy. Rather than understanding my scripted and improvisational works to have adopted opposite strategies, perhaps these strategies could be seen as two sides of the same coin. Althusser's notion of the interpolated subject and Judith Butler's formulations of gender identity as interpolated by social scripts and institutional speech acts together gesture toward the evolutionary inertia behind each personal expression. And so you can see Louis Althusser and Judith Butler cited down there. So they are both philosophers that thought about how society shapes subjectivity. Butler's notion of gender performativity has often been misread as the suggestion that gender is a flippant performance that one can take on and off like clothing. However, the direction of intentionality in the performance of gender is a subtle thing to try to capture. Dennett emphasizes this when he writes that identification cannot be a matter of a pearly Cartesian ego or immaterial soul accepting some memes and rejecting others. The entity that does the endorsement has to be itself some kind of complex meme brain structure. So the social agent, the self, let's just say for now, is not outside of the memes it adopts and propagates. It is itself a system of memes subject to the selection pressures of all memes. Further, in his use of theatrical performance as a framework for observing the presentation of self in everyday life, Erving Goffman did not regard such performances as flippant at all, remarking that the repertoire afforded by anticipatory socialization enables social agents to economically adopt socially coherent behaviors without following a set script. So even though you could characterize my behaviors right now, for example, as I address you, as somehow like a performance, as if I'm performing these acts because society has shaped me to perform these acts in front of you in situations like this, Erving Goffman would say that that's not somehow false or somehow less authentic to yourself, that selfhood itself is always anticipating social situations, and selfhood itself is sort of shaped by the fact of that anticipation. So there's almost nothing outside of this performance. And in a way, performances, we do intuit that they can be more or less authentic, and we can dig later deeper into what we think makes them authentic. But the fact that they are scripted by external factors is not the thing that makes a personal expression inauthentic. That seems to be intrinsic to being a social agent, is the anticipation of how others will receive us. And as Goffman says here, this is quite an unconscious process that we can adopt these coherent behaviors really quickly without seemingly following a set script. To continue, he says, the details of the expressions and movements used do not come from a script, but from command of an idiom, a command that is exercised from moment to moment with little calculation or forethought. In other words, systems, institutions, and social practices write us. Our spontaneous acts are only ever an iteration, the result of an individual communal repertoire. As a concept, repertoire seems to transcend the spontaneity prescription dichotomy by inhering both a momentous driving past which scripts us in the present, and a unique and vivacious present that is phenotypic to that underlying momentum. And phenotype comes from genetics to describe the kind of outward expressions or appearances of underlying encoded genes. So having blue eyes is a phenotype. It's the consequence, the expression of what is somewhere written into the code. So we could say that my behaviors now, as I sit and talk to you here, are phenotypic, like phenotype, the outward expressions, the present expressions of a kind of underlying enormous historical momentum that's driving me into the present and is built up of millions of behaviors performed by other humans long dead now, perhaps, that kind of came before me. So that is driving me into the present. And what you're seeing as a result, my personality expressing itself, is a kind of phenotype to that underlying momentum. Script and improvisation form two sides of the coin that is repertoire. Similarly, I can recognize the orally improvised performances that form the principal outcome of this project as the surface expressions of a repertoire, in some ways both scripted and spontaneous. So now these two things don't seem to be as opposite as they used to be. Deriving from theatre, we can divide performances traditionally into improvised performances and scripted performances, or in the world of music, you can have, for example, jazz jams, improvisational sessions, where the resulting music that the band is playing is not scripted in advance. And then you have like composed performances where an orchestra is following a score, for example. So traditionally we could split up performances into either scripted or improvised. And traditionally we might intuit these things as quite opposite. But as we dig deeper, we can see that even the improvised performances are based on what Goffman was calling a command of an idiom, a kind of way of deploying patterns. And even the way a jazz musician might deploy the patterns they've absorbed from previous playing is itself patterned. So there's a sense in which, even though they might be composing in the moment, the reason why jazz musicians with great skill can harmonize and cohere with one another across the different instruments is because they have a shared knowledge of these musical scripts, these musical formulas. And on the other hand, a composer who is writing a score is relying on performers to enact that in the present and interpret it in the present, along with all the present's contingencies, which might alter the score or the script subtly. And this is what I discovered in my performance practice as well, which initially I imagined was improvised and spontaneous. But I could feel really as I was doing it that as I'm improvising, as I'm being supposedly spontaneous, I'm drawing on some kind of library within me that I have perhaps unconsciously even built, but it's all deriving from some kind of pre-existing reservoir of formulas and scripts, and I'm kind of reading off them in a way, just very quickly and in the moment. So to continue, during my PhD, I accidentally came across a particularly apt genre in which to tease out this distinction between being scripted and spontaneous, and that genre was the introductory presentation. In academic settings, I've often been invited to formally introduce myself to colleagues or to students in the form of a short presentation. This is a scenario in which I'm being asked to give a premeditated impression of myself, right? Because I go away and I have to think about what I'm going to say to the audience about myself. I'm going to go there to introduce them to me and present myself so they know me better afterwards. But because it's something that I've been invited to do in advance and prepare for, it's a premeditated presentation of myself. So as kind of mundane and formal and not to do with what we're talking about as an introductory presentation seems to be, it actually had a lot to do with the matter we're discussing now, this distinction between scripted and spontaneous. So this is a scenario in which I'm being asked to give a premeditated impression of myself. At the same time, given that in this scenario I am entering a social space in which authentic self-presentation is prized, it is preferred that I present as if I'm being spontaneous. Almost everyone who has been in a position to orally present has been advised never to read off a script for risk of coming across too robotic, predetermined, and automaton-like. This is also why, prior to one of these events, the organisers expressly asked me not to prepare any slides, since we want to hear your voice, your reflections on the personal links to your thesis. This instance echoes the broader tendency to give speech primacy over writing, where speech is apparently more spontaneous than writing, a tendency which the philosopher Jacques Derrida pointed out and critiqued in his book of grammatology. The formal self-introduction presents itself as an apt space in which to perform the self as repertoire by switching, as I did when I introduced myself to my new students at the Glasgow School of Art, between visibly reading off a script and then improvising and going off script, and asking listeners to try to track the differences in the scripted and spontaneous Katarinas they were in the process of getting to know. So this was a 10-minute introduction, or even shorter, I think, to me, which I delivered for students at the Glasgow School of Art, and I've linked this presentation below if you want to check it out. But there the idea was that I would read off this script. As you can see in the still, the students could see what I was saying, and so it kind of looked a bit awkward to begin with because, you know, it says here like, "Hi everyone, I'm Katarina," so even the kind of informal colloquialisms were scripted. But then I started talking to them about the fact that, okay, so it seems in a sense disingenuous, or at least more inauthentic way of presenting myself at the moment because I'm reading off this script. But then what I did is I said, okay, I'm going to go off script now, and I'm just going to be myself, and I'm not going to continue reading off this script, and I would like you to track the difference. Is there not also a sense, though, in which now, as I'm presenting myself in a completely spontaneous way, that I'm also being scripted, if not by a text that you can visibly see, maybe I'm being scripted by an invisible text, a biological script, a social script, a cultural script that is my upbringing and my genetics and my environment that is kind of thrusting me into the present. So there's a sense in which I'm being guided by invisible scripts. So I kind of performed that difference for them and then let them sort of decide and compare and contrast the Katarina that was scripted visibly and the Katarina that was perhaps scripted invisibly, or the Katarina that was spontaneous and improvised. So you can check that out in the link below if that interests you. Performance thus presented itself as a way to touch on the distinction between the scripted and the spontaneous, and make it conspicuous enough to critically and intuitively engage with, by exploring the space encapsulating performance and being, repertoire. A note on machine learning and repertoire. The impressive feats of AI to date have primarily been achieved through an approach called machine learning, in which machines are taught to recognize and thus intervene in aspects of our world through reinforcement learning and immersion in vast amounts of data, such as large numbers of images of faces in the case of facial recognition. While the theory that machines could learn in this way, using digital neural networks which gradually build an internal model of similarities and differences between the data to which they are exposed, has long existed, until about 10 years ago, we lacked sufficiently large amounts of data and processing power to put this theory into practice. The staggering amount of multimedia information uploaded to the internet and technological development in computer processing power solved both of these obstacles. And that's where we start to see the rapid development in AI, and more recently, since the publication of this thesis, generative AI that can make images and write text and compose music and so on. So again, remember, this is being written in 2023 and a lot of changes have already occurred in this area. Since then, AI has developed at a rapid pace and become integrated into many areas of daily life, from recommending films on Netflix over automatically filtering job applications for employers to deciding how likely a prisoner is to reoffend if let out on parole. The capacity of AI to match and exceed certain cognitive capabilities of humans in areas such as pattern recognition has been astonishing, but tech company spokesmen and other commentators assured us at the time that while machines may impress us with their prowess for calculation, pattern spotting, and inferences from data, they will never truly have what humans have, that special something, that ingredient X, that emotional investment in the world, a consciousness, a self-awareness. Increasingly, however, the ingredient X that was meant to save us from being reduced to our machine counterparts is beginning to resemble that jolt of indeterminacy, that elusive glitch upon which hopes have been placed to redeem us from an automaton's fate. Perhaps there is something to learn about ourselves when we observe the recent great leaps made in machine creativity via exposure to the corpus of human cultural production, namely that each of us, in a sense, is a model of that corpus, just as OpenAI's GPT is a model of that corpus as it is captured in recorded language. And just as each human being can be said under this analogy to be a model of all human cultural production, at least the portion of it to which they have been exposed, the characters a human being is capable of playing out is comparable to the characters AI language models are beginning to master, and by now pretty much have mastered, as when a user prompts ChatGPT to role-play a particular character before generating a response. And I do find this interview that I'm linking here really interesting. And in it, a YouTube commentator observes how useful it can be to assign ChatGPT a persona before asking it for advice. And she says, the crazy thing is, don't ask me how. Some personalities even give you better responses than others, end quote. This observation touches precisely actually on what this PhD is about. And in chapter 4, I will try and offer an explanation for it, an explanation for why priming ChatGPT or prompting ChatGPT to take on a kind of character before it talks to you might give you more valuable responses and even better advice, and how, in a way, what you can do with ChatGPT, you can actually do on yourself as well.